Higher tire pressure rolls faster. Most riders set it with a thumb and a guess, and the guess is almost always too high. The belief comes straight from road cycling, where 100 psi genuinely is faster on smooth tarmac. But dirt is not tarmac. On a trail surface, a softer tire deforms around roots and rocks instead of bouncing off them. And testing shows the lower pressure is the quicker one. The catch is that the window is narrow. Drop all the way to 10 psi and rolling resistance jumps by over 20%, with riders needing 14% more effort to hold the same climbing speed than they did at 40. Below 20 psi, the penalties stack up fast, and that is why the cheapest upgrade on a mountain bike costs $5 and is called a pressure gauge. A lighter bike is a faster bike. It is the most repeated sentence in cycling and the easiest thing in the world to sell, because weight is the one number on a spec sheet that everybody understands. The physics behind it is real. On a 10-kilometer climb at 7%, a 70-kilo rider pushing 250 watts saves somewhere between 15 and 25 seconds per kilogram dropped, but on a 5% gradient that shrinks to 8 seconds. And on flat ground, it is worth almost nothing at all. 1 kilogram is worth roughly 2.5 watts. A modern frame shape against an old round tube one is worth over 20. Weight only beats aerodynamics above 6 or 7%. And that is why the industry sells grams instead of seconds. Seconds are hard to feel. A weighing scale is not. The front brake will throw you over the bars. Every beginner hears this, usually from somebody who learned it on a motorcycle. There is a grain of truth in it, because grabbing the front lever while sitting bolt upright will pivot the bike. But the front wheel is where the stopping power actually lives. Depending on the machine, the front brake supplies between 70 and 90% of total braking force, and frame designers work to a target of 60 to 80% at the front. The reason is weight transfer. Braking compresses the fork, drives the tire into the ground, and enlarges the contact patch. So the harder the front brake works, the more grip it has to work with. And that is why rear brake-only riders stop slower, not safer. During a hard stop, the rear tire is barely touching the ground it is supposed to be gripping. Full suspension is always faster than a hardtail. The reasoning sounds obvious because a rear shock smooths the ground out, and a smooth ground is a quick one. And on rough terrain, that is exactly what happens. But suspension is not free, and the trade runs both ways. Test comparisons put the hardtail ahead on smoother courses lasting around 2 hours, while the full suspension bike wins over 4 to 6 hours, despite carrying roughly 1.5 kilos more. The rule that comes out of it is simple. The rougher the ground, the more the rear shock earns its weight, and the smoother it gets, the more it costs. A 2011 study ran both bikes over a 105-minute course that was 70% uphill, and that is why the fastest bike is a terrain question, not a category. Cross-country World Cups have been won on both in the same season. 29-inch wheels are always faster. This one got repeated so often that an entire wheel size disappeared because of it. The rolling advantage is genuine, since a bigger wheel meets an obstacle at a shallower angle and carries momentum better over roots and rocks. But bigger wheels are also heavier at the rim, where weight hurts most. A 29-inch wheel carries around 20% more rotational inertia than a 26, which means it takes longer to spin up out of every corner. When Bike Radar ran an objective wheel size test, the 26-inch setup was measured faster than the 29 on downhill sections. And that is why the correct answer is that big wheels hold speed and small wheels find it. The sport spent a decade arguing about this, then quietly settled on running a big wheel at the front and a small one at the back. Carbon frames are fragile. The myth is fed by photographs, because when carbon fails, it fails dramatically, splintering in a way that metal never does. But dramatic is not the same as weak. Carbon retains about 60% of its strength after millions of stress cycles, while aluminium retains around 30%. An aluminium frame has a working fatigue life measured in 5 to 10 years under real loads. Carbon does not gradually soften at all. The ISO 4210 standard requires frames to survive over 100,000 fatigue cycles before they can be sold. Where carbon genuinely loses is sharp point impact, a rock strike or a crash on a rock garden, because carbon cracks where aluminium dents. And that is why the real question is not which material is stronger, but which one fails in a way that can be seen. A cracked carbon tube is obvious. A fatigued aluminium weld is not. An expensive bike makes you faster. Money does buy speed, but it buys it on a curve that flattens brutally. Going from a department store bike to a proper entry-level trail bike changes everything because the difference is functioning brakes, a fork that moves, and a frame that does not flex under pedaling. Going from a $3,000 bike to a $9,000 bike changes far less than the price gap suggests. What the extra $6,000 buys is weight, adjustment range, and finish, and those matter at a level where seconds are already being fought over. For everyone else, the same money spent on tires, a bike fit, and a coach returns more. And that is why the fastest upgrade is almost always the cheapest one. Bike shops know exactly which customers need a new fork and which ones need a new front tire, and only one of those conversations pays the rent. Clipless pedals let you pull up for more power. This is the single most repeated claim in cycling coaching, and it is wrong. A 2008 study in the International Journal of Sports Medicine found the clipless system had no influence on mechanical efficiency, pedaling mechanics, or muscle activity during sub-maximal cycling. Dr. Jeff Broker spent over 10 years measuring pedal forces and published repeatedly that elite and non-elite riders do the same thing. They push harder on the downstroke and they do not pull up. Consciously pulling up actually costs energy and lowers total output. What the pedal really does is stiffen the weak link, locking the foot so force transfers cleanly instead of being lost through a flexing shoe. And that is why clipless pedals are a connection, not an engine. They are a weight belt for the foot, and nobody ever claimed a weight belt made anyone stronger. Tubeless tires don't puncture. Anyone who has watched sealant close a thorn hole in under 2 seconds understands why this belief exists, because on punctures up to about 3 millimeters, the system genuinely is close to magic. But sealant only works on holes it can bridge. A sidewall cut, the long slit a sharp rock opens along the side of a tire, can run 20 millimeters or more, and the only fix on the trail is to fit an inner tube and ride home carrying the tire that was supposed to make tubes unnecessary. Then there is burping, where a hard landing unseats the bead and dumps air instantly, which almost always means the pressure is too low, or the tire is too wide for its rim. And that is why every tubeless rider still carries a tube. The system removes 9 out of 10 flats and makes the last one far messier. More suspension travel makes you a better rider. Travel is the number that gets read first on any spec sheet, and the logic is that if 140 millimeters handles a trail, 180 will handle it better, on a genuine downhill track that holds. Everywhere else it does not. Longer travel comes with a slacker head angle, a longer wheelbase, and a taller front end. And every one of those makes the bike harder to point at low speed and harder to hold on a climb. The bike gets more capable and the rider gets less involved, because the suspension absorbs the mistakes that used to teach something. And that is why the fastest way to improve is usually less bike, not more. The riders who look smoothest on a trail are almost always on the shortest travel bike in the group. Boost spacing was a marketing scam. When it arrived in 2014, it widened rear hub spacing from 142 millimeters to 148, and front from 100 to 110, making every existing wheel obsolete overnight. The anger was completely earned, but the engineering problem behind it was genuine. As wheels grew to 29 inches, spoke bracing angles got shallower and wheels flexed more, and pushing the flanges 6 millimeters apart widened that angle and stiffened the wheel measurably for no weight penalty. It also made room for wider tires and shorter chainstays at the same time, and that is why Boost is the clearest case in cycling of a real fix delivered in the most expensive way possible. The industry solved an actual problem and sent the bill to everyone who had just bought a wheel set. 26-inch wheels died because they were worse. For roughly 25 years, the 26 was mountain biking, and then inside about 4 years, it was gone from every catalog on Earth. The story everybody accepted was that the bigger wheel simply won on merit. The record does not support that. Manufacturers dropped the size because demand collapsed, and because standardizing on fewer wheel sizes is cheaper, not because a test proved it slower. Bike Radar measured the 26-inch setup faster than the 29 on downhill sections. 27.5 was marketed as the best of both worlds, and is itself now disappearing. And that is why the smallest wheel in mountain biking was not beaten. It was discontinued. The last riders keeping 26s alive are on the most technical terrain in the sport, which is exactly where the size was always best.
If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.